Don Lois, hit full screen.
Hit speaker screen.
Anxiety. It's a low-grade fear, an edginess, a dread. It's not so much the onslaught of a storm as the continual threat that one is coming. Sunny days are just a brief interlude.
You get it, Don Lois?
No, we're listening. Go ahead.
Storm clouds of trepidation, suspicion, and apprehension swirl all around you. You're certain the sky is falling, and it's falling disproportionately on you. Anxiety is a big heap of what-ifs, a cascading storm of uncertainties built one on top of the other. What if I don't get the bonus? What if I can't afford braces for the kids? And what if crooked teeth keep them from having friends, career, or a spouse? In everyday life, it might look a lot like the story of a couple we'll call John and Mary. They had been married for more than 30 years, and in that time, they had experienced their share of ups and downs. But life in general had been steady, as some would say, even comfortable, predictable. That is, until the day came for Katie, their youngest child, to leave the nest. Katie had been accepted to an out-of-state college. Her parents couldn't have been more proud, but the trip across country was hard on Mary. Each mile further from home brought with it another anxious worry. Would her relationship with her youngest ever be the same? They had been so close. Would she be safe? Would her new friends be kind to her? Would she remember to call, to check in regularly? Would she want to come home for visits? Each new thought brought with it a dark, ominous cloud of uncertainty. In the weeks that followed, her anxiety grew. The house was so quiet. She cooked meals for two. She missed the soccer games, the sleepovers, the hustle and bustle of family life. She missed the sweet sound of children's voices echoing through the hallways. Everything seemed so empty. A few months went by. Mary thought she might be learning to cope when suddenly the company John worked for lost an important client. John's hours were cut, and with it went the couple's dreams of helping Katie with her tuition. The stress increased for Mary. She felt she needed to go back to work to make ends meet, but it had been years since she held a job. What skills did she have that an employer would want? Where would she even begin? An endless blanket of storm clouds had gathered around their once happy home. And a cryptic message Mary received from the doctors late one Friday afternoon just made things worse. What were these findings from her last test that the nurse referred to? Why did she need to come into the office first thing Monday to discuss them with the doctor? In Mary's mind, the storm had reached hurricane proportions, and there was no safe place left for her and John to hide. They had gone from calm and quiet to perplexed and panicked. The worry was stripping away their peace, their sense of joy, their comfort. Would they ever see the light of day again? Would they escape this impending doom? Would they even survive? Perhaps you have experienced something like this in your life. One day the skies seem sunny and bright, and the next they're dark and foreboding. It's as if the air has been taken out of your lungs and you're left trying to catch your breath. You know, the word anxiety actually comes from a Latin root that means to choke or to squeeze. It takes your breath away for sure. And it also takes your sleep, your energy, your well-being. It makes you want to cry out, as King David once did, "Lord, how many are my foes? How many rise up against me?" You know, anxiety can twist you into an emotional pretzel. It can make your eyes twitch, your blood pressure rise, and your head ache. It's a close cousin to fear, but the two are not twins. Fear sees a threat while anxiety imagines one. Fear screams, "Get out." Anxiety ponders, "What if?" Fear results in fight or flight. Anxiety creates doom and gloom. Fear is the pulse that pounds when you see a coiled rattlesnake in your yard. Anxiety is the voice that tells you, never ever walk barefooted through the grass. There might be a snake out there somewhere. The chances are you or someone you know has a serious struggle with anxiety. According to recent studies, in a given year, 17% of Americans will feel the effects of a panic attack. The United States is now the most anxious nation in the world. The land of stars and stripes has become the country of stress and strife. It's a costly achievement. Stress-related ailments now cost the country an estimated $300 billion each year in medical bills and lost productivity. Between 1997 and 2004 alone, Americans more than doubled their yearly spending on anti-anxiety medications. We've also seen an exponential increase over the years in rates of depression. But how can this be? Our cars are safer than ever. We regulate food and water and electricity. Though gangs still prowl our streets, most of us do not live under the danger of imminent attack. Yet if worry were an Olympic event, we'd win the gold medal. One would think that Christians, at least, would be exempt from anxiety, but we're not. We've been taught that the Christian life is a life of peace, and when we don't have peace, we assume the problem lies within us. We not only feel anxious, but we feel guilty about our anxiety. And the result is a downward spiral of worry, guilt, worry, guilt. It's enough to cause a person to get anxious. It's also enough to make us wonder if Paul was out of touch with reality when he wrote in Philippians 4:6, "Be anxious for nothing." We might think be anxious for less would have been enough, or be anxious on Thursdays only, or be anxious but only in seasons of severe affliction. But Paul doesn't seem to offer any leeway here. Be anxious for nothing. Nada, zilch, zero. Is this what he means? Well, not exactly. Paul wrote the phrase in the present active tense, which implies an ongoing state. It's the life of perpetual anxiety that Paul wants to address. The Locato Revised Translation reads, "Don't let anything in life leave you perpetually in angst and breathless." The presence of anxiety is unavoidable, but the prison of anxiety is optional. It's interesting Paul chose these words because if anyone had cause to be anxious, it was he. And if anyone knew about literal prisons with literal walls that close a person in, it was Paul. Step back in time with me for a moment, about 2,000 years. Picture Paul at about 60 years old. He's been a Christian for 30 years now, and there's scarcely a seaport across the Mediterranean Sea that he doesn't know. He spread the gospel of Jesus to the Jews and Gentiles alike across the known world. But now he's confined in a Roman prison. Peer through the tiny window of the cell. There he is, bent and frail, shackled to the arm of a Roman guard. Who knows when his back last felt a bed or his mouth knew a good meal? The trouble began for him a couple of years earlier in Jerusalem when the Jewish religious leaders accused him of blasphemy. They nearly killed him and then unfairly imprisoned him. They maligned his name, violated his rights, and disrupted his plans. Fortunately for Paul, his Roman citizenship saved his neck. Entitled to a Roman hearing, he journeyed from Jerusalem to Rome. He survived a hurricane and a shipwreck on the way, only to be bitten by a snake. He survived the snake bite, only to be stranded on an island for 3 months. And when he was finally delivered to Rome, his case languished for 2 years. But at least he can take comfort in the thought of the united congregations he helped strengthen, right? Well, hardly. There's competition in Corinth, legalists swarming in Galatia. Crete is plagued by money grabbers, and Ephesus is stalked by womanizers. False preachers are accusing him of profiteering off the gospel. Even some of his own friends have turned against him. Even worse, Paul has every reason to believe his life will soon be over. The Emperor Nero has learned to curry the favor of Roman citizens by killing believers, of which Paul is the best known. Nero feeds disciples to the lions for lunch, and Paul has no guarantee that the same won't happen to him. Paul knows the only thing between him and death is a nod from moody Nero. Yet, to read Paul's words in his letter to the Philippian believers, you'd think that he just arrived at a Jamaican Beach hotel. I mean, just look at the words. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. Let your gentleness be known to all men. The Lord is at hand. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. Finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there is any virtue, and if there is anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. Paul's letter bears not one word of fear or complaint. Not one. He never shakes a fist at God. Instead, he lifts his thanks to the Lord in the midst of his trials. His prescription for anxiety begins with a call to rejoice. And he uses every tool in the box to call this to our attention. First, he employs a present imperative tense, so we will hear him say, continually, habitually rejoice. Next, as if the verb tense isn't enough, he removes the expiration date. Rejoice in the Lord always, not just on paydays or Fridays or good days or birthdays, but always. And if perchance the verb tense and the repetition are inadequate, he repeats the command, again I say, rejoice. We aren't the first to read the word always and arch an eyebrow. I mean, how can we do this? It's one thing to rejoice in the Lord when life is good, but how can we rejoice when the odds are against us, when the skies have become dark and gray, as they did for John and Mary, and the life we now have is the one we want to run away from? Is it possible for any of us to maintain an uninterrupted spirit of gladness? Note from the passage that this is not Paul's challenge. The urge or the command is to rejoice in the Lord. This is a call not to a feeling, but to a decision. It is a deeply rooted confidence that God exists, that He is in control, and that He is good, that He is sovereign. The Bible uses this word, sovereignty, to describe God's perfect management of the universe. It reveals how God preserves and governs every element, and how He is continually involved with all created things, directing them to act in a way that fulfills His divine purpose. Paul's firm belief in God's sovereignty enables him to see himself not as a victim of unseen, turbulent, random forces, but as a conqueror in Christ. This was what enabled Paul to hold firm to his faith in spite of his circumstances. He had erected cast iron stabilizers in the center of his soul. Let Nero rage. Let the preachers accuse. Let the church members bicker. Let the storms blow. His faith would never collapse, for he had stabilized it with a sturdy belief system. Paul knew this proper understanding of sovereignty was huge in the treatment of anxiety. He knew that belief always precedes behavior. If you want to change the way a person responds to life, you have to first change what that person believes about life. This is why he advises his readers not to seek total control, but to relinquish all control to a God who is truly in control. We can't run the world, but we can entrust it to God. Peace is within reach, not for lack of problems, but for the presence of a sovereign Lord. So rather than rehearse the chaos of the world, we rejoice in the Lord's sovereignty, as Paul did. Paul believed God highly exalted Jesus and gave him the name that is above every name. The conditions in Paul's prison might be miserable, but he knew that high above it all, God was at work for his good pleasure. To read Paul is to read the words of a man who believed in the innermost part of his being in the steady hand of a good God. He lived beneath the shadow of God's wings. The shadow of storm clouds was what Mary chose to see in her situation. The conditions of her prison were certainly miserable. But things began to change one day when she read these words from King David. You, Lord, are a shield about me, my glory, the one who lifts my head high. And she decided to see God's shield as the shadow surrounding her, protecting her from the storm. Now, her circumstances did not change that night or the next week, but what did change is how she began to approach those circumstances. Instead of viewing herself as exposed to the elements and at the mercy of the storm, she began to picture herself in the shelter of God's grace. As she rejoiced in the Lord in spite of the storm, the skies began to clear. Mary also came to realize that many of the scenarios she had built up in her mind were exactly that, in her mind. Her daughter in college did not lose contact with her as she feared. Yes, their relationship was different and she still missed her, but her daughter called frequently and even made plans for coming home on winter break. She stopped worrying about what employers might think of her and actually received from callbacks when she sent out her resume. She began to actually look forward to the idea of rejoining the workforce. And the news from the doctor wasn't as dire as she had built up in her mind. Yes, her blood pressure was high, and she would need to make changes in her life to manage it. But no longer did she fear the future, for she chose to trust in God's sovereignty. Now, there's no doubt that life will bring us pain, but we have a choice as to how we view our situation. We can wear our hurt or wear our hope. We can outfit ourselves in our misfortune or clothe ourselves in God's providence. We can cave in to the pandemonium of life or lean into the perfect plan of God. We can say with Paul that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. We can agree that God doesn't make up the plan as he goes along, but he works out everything in conformity with the purpose of his will. When you trust in the sovereignty of God and learn to rejoice in him, it reframes the way you face your fears. You discover how to talk yourself off the ledge, view bad news through the lens of God's will, discern the lies of Satan, and tell yourself the truth. You discover a life that is characterized by calm and develop tools for facing the onslaughts of anxiety. Of course, this requires some work on your part. And I certainly don't mean to leave the impression that anxiety can be waved away with a simple pep talk. In fact, for some of you, God's healing will include the help of therapy or medication. But this much is sure. It is not God's will that you lead a life of perpetual anxiety. It is not his will that you face every day with dread and trepidation. He made you for more than a life of breath-stealing angst and mind-splitting worry. He has a new chapter for your life, and he is ready to write it. So, if today you are troubled, restless, and sleepless, I challenge you to rejoice in the Lord's sovereignty. I challenge you to believe that good things will happen and that God was speaking to you when He said, "In everything God works for the good of those who love Him." I challenge you to expose your worries to an hour of worship, and when you do, I believe you will find your concerns melting away. I believe that by His power and sovereignty, you can be anxious for nothing and discover the peace that passes understanding.
Thank you, Daryl. Your thoughts? And
Now, I can tell you the book does follow that.
okay,
Okay, go up.
Yeah. So that was good. That was
That
good.
was chapter 1 of the book.
did the book add more though?
Yeah, it added more,
Not much,
but,
really.
but it was very similar.
Okay. What is the difference between the presence of anxiety and the prison of anxiety? Is it okay to have anxiety according to him? Or is it a sin? Beth?
It's natural.
It's natural.
Yeah, I don't think you can avoid having some anxiety in your life.
Would you say, Beth?
I don't think you can avoid having some anxiety in your life.
You'd have to kind of like live in a bubble, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
What's the difference then between presence and prison of anxiety?
To me, the prison of anxiety means you're afraid to move. You're afraid to do anything. You can have anxiety and let it be a spur to handle things, or you can let it freeze you from taking care of things.
Okay. Other thoughts? That's good. I agree with you 100%, Beth. Other things? Other ideas on that? The difference is between the prison and the presence.
I think for me, the presence of anxiety is like a red flag. It's a signal, that either something is amok with me or there is a situation that is outside of myself that very possibly I have absolutely no control over or may not even involve me. But to me, if I'm feeling anxious, I have to really sit down and sort of dig deep and say what's really going on here. And until I do that, I cannot take any action to resolve the situation, nor can I really turn it over. So that's the first step for me.
I'm a lot like that too. I think I
like that.
get in such a buzz that I don't even know until I start feeling anxious that something's amiss. Okay, somebody else.
Well, the presence is kind of like it's always there because there is anxiety in all of our lives, but I think the prison is how you handle it. I mean, if you allow it to control you, then you're going to be in prison. If you don't allow it to control you, then you're not going to be.
I think that's a lot like what Beth said, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good. He says the presence is what you guys all said. It's unavoidable. If you're human, you're going to get anxious over things. But the prison is optional, letting it control you. And and this is where I think that God gives us tools. And I think of Philippians 4. What are you going to do with it? And Paul gives us those tools. Give it to the Lord. Trust God. Remember that God is sovereign. Think on those things which are positive. And we talked about this last week. When you give it to God, give it to God. Do you know what I mean by that? A lot of times we'll give it to God and then we'll act like he can't handle it unless we keep reminding him or keep asking him over and over. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Just in case you didn't get it the first time, Lord.
The problem for me is if I sit in anxiety, I can honestly say I've certainly never made probably one good decision that has been driven by anxiety. And the other concern for me is if my mind is cluttered up with anxiousness, that really blocks my channel to God. My mind is like those storm clouds he saw, and I'm so caught up in the anxiety. I'm not open to the guidance that God is sending me, either through, the people in my lives or scripture or whatever. So I need to step away from the anxiety to receive his help.
I'm relating perfectly to what you're saying. What the rest of you think? How do you step away, Nancy?
Well, I guess the first thing is to identify it, what's really going on here. And then I ask for help, I pray, I try and raise my level of awareness so that I see things that answer the message that I'm looking for. I either read something, or one of you all will say something, or I seek, guidance from someone I trust. Those are usually what I do. And I think of my past experience. I think, nothing lasts forever. This too shall pass. I don't know what the outcome will be, but it will not be the same. Something is going to happen. So I just need to stay open and flexible and have faith.
I don't know why it keeps blinking you out.
Do you think it's the light coming in the window?
Probably.
I think you all are magic's what I think.
Yeah.
The way you teleported yourself to that Caribbean island, I think it's a little bit of magic going on.
Walt, if you will go to your video settings and remove the dynamic background and just use the standard background, it'll keep you all together there.
Let's just see your boring old house, okay?
I don't know how to do that.
Go to your home screen, video settings, the little gearbox down at the bottom, and click on that gearbox, and then change from your Key West background to a standard background, because you're fading in and out.
That's more like Costa Rica.
I'm not fading in and out. Eunice is.
It's coming in the window, so I pulled the shade, but it doesn't seem to matter.
No.
It looks like those science fiction movies.
Dynamic background.
The very cheesy special effects.
Look at that, and there I go.
There you go.
And back to your topic, Mel. My takeaway was subrogation to God, and that solves your anxiety problems by subrogating yourself to God's will and his control, and saying that he's in there. Then your problems are always minuscule compared to what he's dealing with. And so I think, that my takeaway from his discussion was you think you got it bad, well, let God take care of it. He's got it worse.
Well, something else too, and there's a scripture. It's in Thessalonians, 1 Thessalonians 5:16-18, and 18 says, "Be thankful in all circumstances." I found that helps me. If you can find something to be thankful in most circumstances, there's always some silver lining you can find, and seemingly so, in a lot of things, and that helps. I mean, obviously it's not a cure-all, but it does help, I think.
Remember the movie Bruce Almighty?
Yeah.
Remember when at one point all these voices were coming at him at once, and he said, "How do you do this?" And God said, "That's just this area. That's not the whole world." And Bruce couldn't handle the voices that he was hearing just from that general area. So God has the whole world to deal with, and we've just got our own little problems to deal with. So we have to trust him that he can handle it.
And I think that I go along with, as we were thinking about that, I think of trust as being an action, because you can't do a whole lot to control your feelings. I think you often control your feelings through actions. And I kind of think back on,
He said you can change it.
Eunice's head must be hurting. Her
I'm
head
not moving.
freezing out.
he actually says rejoicing in the Lord is not a feeling, but it's a decision. I think, John, that's kind of like what you said. It's not a feeling, but it's a decision to trust God. Now, you've made a decision to trust him. Now, do it.
Devil, get behind me.
You want to switch?
Say it again, Belinda.
Devil, get behind me.
Yeah. And it's kind of like, instead of, Nancy, staying in your anguish, oh God, help me, 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 and staying in that anguish, it's kind of like a decision. I will trust him.
And if you make that decision, then you can rejoice in knowing that God's going to handle it.
Yeah. And
All right.
And that kind of brings me back to, did you guys read the quote from Richard Rohr that I sent you?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I love that because it puts it on
Roar.
a really realistic,
He's talking about.
earthy point of view. He says, if you try to resist it, it's like trying to ignore the elephant in the room. If you try to push back. But he says, just change your focus. Go from resisting, fighting it, change your focus to the positive. You know, all right, I've trusted God, not trying to, I'm going to trust God. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. To, I trust you, Lord. Now, God, what a beautiful day, or I'm thankful for, somebody in here mentioned that they start being thankful for the things that they have. And that's just putting together Paul's Philippians and First Thessalonians and
What to do.
other admonitions. Other ideas on that? It tells us, Lucado wrote on page 17, to rejoice in the Lord, we must have a deep belief in his sovereignty over our lives. The more we believe in his control, the more we relinquish our control, which is just exactly what all of you were saying. How does that fit in with Weatherhead's The Circumstantial Will of God? Dick, this is a good one for you, buddy.
Ask it again.
All right. Lucado says that the way that we find peace is our deep belief in the sovereignty of God's will over our lives. And so my question is, how will this fit with, or does it, Weatherhead's teachings of his concept of the circumstantial will of God?
Well, I can relate that to my own way of handling stress or whatever. Anytime that I find myself with a bit of anxiety because of something that perhaps has happened in the family, or Belinda's mad at me or something like that, it's the circumstance that I'm in at that time. I have a very easy way of resolving it and getting it out of my head. And it's pretty simple. I go walking And whilst I'm walking, I say, "Dear Lord, please, you take this. I can't handle it." And I walk away from it. And it's, you know, the circumstance, it's pretty easy for me to turn it over to God, because I've heard all of my life, I've heard that this is the way we're supposed to do it. And it just is easier for me if I take a walk and do it. Used to be I would take a jog and do it. But now I'm too old to jog, so I just go out and take a walk. But it's the circumstance. I do believe that, you know, and I'm not trying to make light of prayer by any means.
Oh.
But, you know, even if in that moment, I don't even have to say the prayer, because God knows what I'm thinking. God knows the circumstance. And it's pretty easy for it just to leave my mind.
I'm hearing you 100%. And
the thing that I think, I'm just going to use Dick and I as an example, but, you know, since I had that stroke, Dick can get very anxious, and I can too at times when my blood pressure spikes to way more than it should be. And so how do we come down from it? I think we both take, and, you know, the first thought is of God. Should we be going to the hospital, or, you know, is it just something that I'm going to deal with for a while? But it puts us both in a very anxious state when it does run up like that. But I think both of us handle it in the way of going to God first and say, you know, calm us both down to see what's going to happen, you know.
I think that is like the best description of this question, the sovereignty of God and the circumstantial will of God, and our trusting that I could have ever imagined. I even wasn't real sure whether I wanted to answer this question. I do the same thing, and I do that with people that hurt and make me angry. I'll say, Lord, I give her to you, because I don't want to stew around about her. You know what I'm saying? And I do that.
The good news there was that you didn't say a hymn.
But that was the best explanation I could have ever imagined. Thank you.
I do have one other input. That
Please.
Last week when we were talking about fear, and it got me to thinking, and we had watched a movie that I guess it was the next day, and it was about Colombia, with the cartels in Colombia, not Mexico. And of course, I spent a lot of time in Colombia, a lot of time in Mexico, and a lot of time in the Middle East, and a lot of time in Russia, and all of that. And some of you know that I've written an autobiography. Some of you have read parts of that. And I allude to some of the things that I've been through in my life. But I didn't tell the whole story. And I got to thinking about it. And when Belinda and I went to bed that next night, I said, Belinda, have I ever come home from a trip and said to you, I was scared? And she said, no, I don't think so. I said, well, would you like for me to tell you some real scary stories that might be the sequel to my autobiography? Oh. And she said, nope, I don't want to hear them. So there you go. I can't write them. But because, and I say that tongue in cheek, but even throughout all of the years of traveling to over 120 countries, I have been in so many situations. And literally, I have been able, just in my mind, just to say, God, it's up to you. Get me out of this, or whatever. And it's worked. It's worked.
I'm going to throw in one more thing. I have sometimes, I guess, when I, and this really follows up on exactly what Dick just said, but sometimes I get to the point where I honestly can just throw my hands up and say, God, I can hardly wait to see how you're going to handle this. And there's really not just, it not only takes away my anxiety, but it's with great optimism and curiosity. You know, I can hardly wait to see how you will ever unravel this. This looks absolutely impossible to me.
What about the situation now with all the virus and everything? You know, it's going to be exciting to see how it all works out. I hope.
Of course, y'all have to understand. For many of those years when I was traveling, I was dealing with a product called Prozac.
I thought you were agriculture.
He was both.
I was both on the agricultural side, but on the pharmaceutical side, and the big product through most of those times. One was an agricultural product. The other one was Prozac.
Well, I think
So were you self-medicating? Is that what you're
No, I was telling others how to do it.
I think they use Prozac in dogs for obsessive compulsive behavior.
That's right. But let me tell you another thing. Lily is now doing work with the antibodies. We were talking about
With Johnson.
immune and so on. So I've got my fingers crossed on that one that they'll come up with a good therapy. We'll see.
Yeah.
It's right around the corner if it works.
What did you do to your wife, Walt?
I'm sorry, what?
What did you do to your wife?
First unit.
Did a coconut fall on her head?
She's behind that tree.
Instead of where's Waldo, where's
She went
unit?
for a swim.
Oh, goodness.
Well, our session is over. It has been a blessing for me. I hope it has for you.
Very nice.
Yes.
My hat off to your genius. Walt, it was 120 Ohio State players, I'm pretty sure.
I just wanted to say that you've got 12 people present on this today. In my time in the class, which is 3 or 4 months, that's the most you've ever had. So this is amazing.
Yes. When we get back, we'll take our computers with us.
Please don't.
We may have to change the class name to the Nuts.
Yeah.
Would someone like to close us with a prayer? I hear the wind blowing in that palm.
Walt, can you close us with a prayer?
Dear God, look after Scott and his family with his untimely death from overdose. Look after all of us here and others in the church. Keep us safe from the virus. Let us have a good day with God today. Amen.
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 Thank you. Have
Thank
a good
you.
week, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Hey, Mel and Daryl, thank you so much for your leadership. Appreciate everything.
Oh,
Bye-bye.
I
Absolutely.
love you guys. You know, I was kind of depressed today. I think from 2 or 3 days of a headache, and I am joyous now. I love you guys. I truly love you.
Feelings
Love you
mutual.
too.